Hello and welcome to video number 3 in week 1 in the series of the neuroscience program, and we are working our way through the brain. And in the last video we talked about some of the orientation of the brain, the sections through the brain, and we talked about the major lobes of the brain: the frontal lobe, the occipital lobe, the parietal lobe and the temporal lobe. I want to extend in this video some of the other areas and show you some of the other areas of the brain. When we look at the parietal lobe, we do see in this model of the brain 2 regions. There's a region here in the parietal lobe that is coloured in red, and a region behind that that is coloured in blue. This region in the front is called the motor cortex, and the region posterior to that is called the sensory cortex. I need to bring your attention to a number of other terms, and some of the terms are the gyrus or the gyri and the sulcus or the sulci. So the gyrus, if you can see that there are folds in the brain, and these are the gyruses or the gyri within the brain, and then you get these little valleys within the brain, and these are the sulci or the sulcus within the brain. And right here in the middle there is a gyri, or a sulcus if you like, that pretty much separates the front and the back of the brain, and that's called the central sulcus. The central sulcus. And in front of the central sulcus we have the gyri, which is called the pre-sulcus gyri, which is the motor, and the post-sulcus gyri, which is the sensory part of that brain. So everything that I feel, for example, I'll just put this down. If I touch my finger on the right hand, I feel that. Even if I close my eyes and I touch my finger, I feel that that is my finger. If I touch somewhere on my back, somewhere on my leg, somewhere on my face, even with my eyes closed, if someone else touched these regions, I have a map in my mind as to where these things are. And I have a map in my mind as to where these things are because the afferent nervous system, the sensory nervous system, is connected to my spine, to my brain, to a position along this gyrus, along this sensory part of the brain. So my finger might be this little spot here. My face might be this little spot here. My lips, my tongue might be this spot here. And because it's located somewhere different in the sensory nerve, I actually have the capacity to, in my mind's eye, to know where I'm being stimulated. This leads us to the discussion that a lot more of that sensory part of the brain is devoted to where I have more receptors, where I have more feeling, where I have the capacity to control more, for example. So my lips, my tongue, my fingers, for example, my genitals have a lot more of this part of the brain devoted to it than, say, my thighs, my back. I don't go around feeling things with my back, do I? But I do go around feeling things with my fingers. So I have more concentration of receptors in my fingers than I would in my back. So therefore there's more concentration of the brain that's devoted or a higher concentration of the sensory brain that's devoted to these parts of my body. The red part is called the motor cortex, and that mirrors very closely the sensory cortex in terms of how much of each part of that is devoted to various parts of my body. So my fingers, where I have very, very fine control, my lips, my tongue, my eyes, where I have very, very fine control. There's a lot more of my motor cortex that's devoted to those. So if I want to move a part of my body, I initiate it from here, from the motor cortex. I think about what I want to do, and then there's a train of pathways that occurs that ends up in the motor cortex, from the motor cortex down through my efferent nervous system to a skeletal muscle to make things move, to make things pretty much happen. If I got an electrode and I stimulated different parts of this motor cortex, then I will actually move different skeletal muscles. The right controls the left, and the left controls the right side of the body, and vice versa. When we have sensory, it's the right sensory organs move and go to the left, and vice versa from the left to the right. So somewhere along the brainstem here, nerves cross over to the opposite side of where they originated. So that's the motor cortex and the sensory cortex. I want to split this brain open for us so that we can see other structures within here. A little bit hard at this point in time. There we go. We've split that brain open, and the first thing that I want us to notice is that this part of the brain that we've talked about, which is really the encephalized brain, the bulk that we see, is quite separate, and you can see that in this model. But also, you know, if we take a live brain and look at it, it looks quite separate from the rest of this brain. Having said that, it is in some ways quite separate, and as we move through evolution, most vertebrate species have this part of the brain and this part of the brain. However, the encephalized brain gets larger and larger and more complex as we move up the evolutionary scale. A couple of things to notice here. This white bit would extend further down, and this is your spinal cord. The top of your spinal cord is the brainstem, and the brainstem has three separate regions that we can divide it into. Sitting behind and on top of the brain, behind the brainstem really, is this little structure here, and this little structure here we call the cerebellum. Now, cerebellum, as opposed to the cerebrum, the cerebellum is translated to little brain. So this really means a little brain. Now, the function of the cerebellum is mainly to do with motor movements. So it coordinates motor movements. It calculates coordinates so that as we move, we can make appropriate and we can make smooth movements. So that's pretty much its major function. So it has to do with motor movements. If it gets cerebellar damage, it does affect motor movements. I just want to bring your attention to these spaces. Can you see how there's a space there? And the brain is not just a solid structure. It has these spaces, these fluid-filled spaces, and these fluid-filled spaces are called ventricles, and this is where cerebrospinal fluid flows through. There are ventricles that we call lateral ventricles. So this here is a lateral ventricle. Between the cerebellum and the spinal cord, we have a little space there. That's called the fourth ventricle. And sitting where my finger would be is a space. So if you can think about the left half of the spine, the top of the brain, the brainstem, and the right half of the brainstem, if you bring those two together, can you see how there's a space in there? That space, which would be where my finger is here, that's called the third ventricle. And all these ventricles are connected with each other through aqueducts. And the fourth ventricle is continuous with the spinal canal. So this is the space that is fluid filled within the spinal cord, in the middle of the spinal cord that goes all the way down the vertebrae. So these are the ventricles of the brain. At the bottom of the encephalized brain, if you like, sitting at the top of the brainstem, is this structure here, which is quite visible. It's quite thick, very, very dense and fibrous, and that's called the corpus callosum. And the corpus callosum are fibers. By fibers we mean neurons, nerve cells, that run side to side in a lateral fashion. And it's the commissure, or the communicating fibers, between the right brain and the left brain. So the left brain and the right brain can only communicate with each other through the corpus callosum. And if you've got a thicker corpus callosum versus a thinner corpus callosum, that is more fibers versus lower number of fibers, then the right and left can communicate better with each other. And it's been shown that there are differences in individuals in the size of that corpus callosum, as there are in many of the structures of the brain. And we know this now through neuroplasticity, that if you use it, it gets bigger. Just like muscle, if you use it, it gets bigger. Just like neurons, if you use them, they become more complex. There's more connections. The brainstem has a number of structures, and we'll talk more about that as we go along. There is structures within the brainstem that control autonomic functions, that control things like heartbeat, that control body temperature, that control your drive for food, that control all of these autonomic functions, your breathing rate. So all of that happens in the brainstem. Okay, and as I said, there's 3 different regions to that brainstem. At the top of that brainstem, and I'll take that, so there's a coronal section. I'll take that out, and this is looking at one half of the brainstem. So this is duplicated over here. So if you can put in mirror image there, you'll see the brainstem that comes to the top. Sitting directly on top of the brainstem is this structure, and this structure is called the thalamus. Everything that ends up in the brain goes through the thalamus, okay? And that's this structure right here, the thalamus, and there's another one there. And from the thalamus, you have nerves that move to all regions of the brain. Lying underneath the thalamus is the hypo. Hypo is under. Hypothalamus. And the hypothalamus sits just here, underneath the thalamus. It sits just here. It's not a distinct structure like that, but there's regions within that area that control all of our basic drives, our drive for thirst, our drive for hunger, our drive for pleasure, etc., 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 etc. And we can give you multiple examples, and I'll give you some material or direct you towards some material to read that relates to the structure of the hypothalamus. Underneath the hypothalamus is this little structure here called the pituitary gland. And the pituitary gland, we grew up in high school learning that the pituitary gland is the master gland. And the pituitary gland releases hormones. Its major function is to control the hormonal system, which is the other great communicating system of the body. So we tend to talk about axes of hormonal axes. So we can talk about the adrenal axis. And the adrenal axis is the hypothalamus, which controls the activity of the pituitary, which controls the activity of the adrenal gland in releasing various hormones. We have the gonadal axis, the hypothalamus, which controls the pituitary, which controls the gonads, whether it be the male or the female gonads, to release a number of hormones that control sexual function. In males, testosterone; in females, we're looking at estrogen and progesterone. For example, the control of the 28-day menstrual cycle. It all starts in the hypothalamus, to the pituitary, to the gonads themselves. Now, what controls the hypothalamus? Well, the hypothalamus has a number of inputs into it, including the brain. So thought processes coming from the frontal cortex, cognitive processes can control the hypothalamus. So your cognitive processes can control your menstrual cycle, for example. If you're highly stressed, then you're not going to menstruate. And that's been shown many times over the decades of research that's been conducted into the area. While the brainstem has a number of regions, a collection of nerves that control many different functions, I want to talk about one major one. This relates to consciousness. There's a series of, or a network of nerves or fibers within the brainstem we call the reticular activating system. You may have heard of that term before. And the reticular activating system is a system that controls the electrical activity in the brain. So we know that we can have alpha, beta, delta, theta waves in the brain. And these different levels of activity in the brain, electrical activity in the brain, are pretty much controlled by the activity of the reticular activating system right here in the brainstem. The reticular activating system sends neurons, nerve cells, communicating nerve cells, to all parts of the brain to regulate its level of consciousness, from being unconscious, i.e. sleep, being unconscious, i.e. under anesthesia, to being highly conscious, as I am now, because I have to think about what I'm saying all of the time and make sure it makes sense and make sure that it relates to what you're doing. So my brain is very active at the moment because I'm I'm doing some high-powered thinking about what I have to say. None of this is reversed. It's just things that I want to express to you. So the more activity in the reticular activating system, the higher the activity in the brain. So if you're dozing off right now because my voice is lulling you into sleep, then it's because the reticular activating system level of activity within that is starting to go down, which brings the level of electrical activity in the brain, and you slowly start to doze off. General anesthetics. Where do you think general anesthetics work? General anesthetics work in this reticular activating system. It turns it down and turns it off. And the brain is turned off. You don't feel anything. A surgeon can come along, cut through you, activate as many afferent neurons as you want, those neurons, while they're activated, would send impulses to the brain. To where? To the sensory cortex of the brain. But will the brain notice that? Will the brain respond to that? Absolutely not. Why not? Because the brain is chemically turned off by the anesthetic through turning off of the reticular activating system, turning off those signals to the rest of the brain, which turns the brain off, and you don't feel it. I'll give you one example other than anesthesia. You fall asleep. You're in deep sleep. While you're asleep, your reticular activating system is turned off. It's just like anesthesia. It's turned off, okay? But you wake up from it eventually, okay? So there are centers in there within the brain that control all of this activity that goes on. So you eventually wake up from sleep. But let's say you're asleep and someone comes along and, I don't know, grabs a pin, sticks a pin in your toe. Do you wake up? Some of us will, some of us won't. Most of us, if it's prolonged sticking of the pain and prolonged activity, will actually wake up. If that activity goes very, very quickly, so I come along and I just give you a pinprick to your big toe and cause you to wake up. And let's say that once that stimulus, which causes you to wake up, is gone, do you know why you woke up? If there is no pain coming from your toe? Absolutely not. You know you've woken up. You've woken up because signals that are traveling to your brain, that go to your brain that doesn't register initially, slowly turn on the reticular activating system, which wakes you up. But in the absence of any stimulus, pain, you don't know why you woke up. You wake up and go, ooh. If there was pain still coming from there, you wake up and eventually you go, oh, I feel pain, and it's coming from my foot. Oh, it's actually coming from my toe. I can localize that. You look down, and there is a pin stuck at the end of it. You go, that's an odd one, but you go, how the hell did that get there? So that is the brainstem, and it controls level of consciousness, and it controls most of your basic functions, such as heart rate, breathing. So unless you've got damage to this region, your heart rate's still going to continue, your breathing's going to continue. You can actually get rid of all of that cortex and still be alive, be vegetable, but you still be alive, because most of your vegetative functions are controlled by the brainstem, and unless you damage them, all of those functions will still occur. So there's the cerebellum, the spinal cord, the top of that, which is the brainstem, and the thalamus. Okay, let's keep moving and talk about some of the other structures that we have here very, very quickly, because time is catching up with us. When we look deep into the brain, again, here's the frontal lobe, the occipital lobe, the parietal lobe, and then we've got our temporal lobes off to the side. A couple of important regions for us to think about, and those important regions are things like the Broca's area, the Wernicke's area, the auditory control centers or the primary auditory centers, and the primary auditory centers will lie, if I can put the coronal section back in, will lie deep within these regions here, auditory within the temporal lobe here. Wernicke's, we're looking at a region in the parietal lobe back here. Broca's area, we're looking at a region again in the parietal to temporal lobe right in here. Now, there's no structure that defines Wernicke's and Broca's, etc., auditory, visual centers. There's no distinct structure such as these little structures. Within here, we also have major areas such as the basal ganglia. Again, these are regions that have that are put together for major functional systems of the body. So, you know, Broca's with respect to speech production, Wernicke's with respect to understanding of speech, understanding of that speech. So we have distinct structures and we have indistinct structures, but regions of the brain. They are either called nuclei or they are called ganglia, such as the basal ganglia, and then there are various nuclei that are dotted throughout the brainstem, the thalamus that control major functions. Okay, I think I'm going to leave that there because that's a little bit more physiology than you probably need, but nonetheless some interesting physiology. Thank you very much.